is good. Uni good. Okay. Actually, I don't have my timer up. Edina negates. Contention 1 is proxy war. U.S. military commitment is calming Saudi Arabia. Sunique 18 of the German Institute on Global Studies explains that as American commitment declines, Saudi assertiveness and militarization increase as a direct result. Indeed, Rupert 17 of the Century Foundation explains that due to their profound fear and anxiety about Iranian hegemony, when Obama disengaged from the Gulf, Saudi Arabia adopted a hard-line, aggressive foreign policy, starting a war and imposing blockades. Sunique warns that Iran challenges the Saudi leadership's legitimacy through its demonstration of alternative forms of government, concluding that Saudi Arabia is willing to push back against any change to their power. 2C18 of Princeton University furthers that today, because Saudi Arabia leaders feel that they are the last country standing in the way of a total Iranian regional dominance, they believe that any compromise is acquiescence to Iran's regional power. Thus, McKinnis 17 of the Daily Beast writes that if America reduced presence in the region, Gulf states would be forced to contain Iranian influence themselves, concluding that because Saudi Arabia would not allow an Iranian proxy on their border, Saudi Arabia would fund their own Sunni proxy forces to fight Iran. History agrees. Goldenberg 17 of Foreign Policy confirms that empirically a lack of trust in the U.S. led the Saudis to act more aggressively on their own out of a position of insecurity, arming groups in Syria, intervening in Bahrain, and launching their intervention into Yemen. Overall, Lova 18 of the European Council on Foreign Relations finds that there are 5 potential proxy conflict hotspots across the Persian Gulf, including Qatar, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. Any conflict escalation risks the lives of millions, as the NRC 20 quantifies that any escalation in regional conflict would be deadly for aid lifelines on the brink of collapse, putting 42 million aid-dependent civilians at risk of death. Contention 2 is global destabilization. Right now, the U.S. has strong support for our allies. Farouk 20 of Stanford University reports that after the Soleimani strike, U.S. credibility is renewed, even deepening cooperation with Saudi Arabia. However, should the U.S. pull from the Gulf, Cook 19 for Foreign Policy explains that reducing U.S. presence would have global ramifications because it would force our allies to doubt the reliability of the U.S., weakening our global alliances and partnerships that are required to compete with geopolitical rivals. The Middle East is key for American power. Travamov 19 of the Wall Street Journal writes that global leaders are watching America's behavior in the Middle East, with the region viewed as a litmus test for American power around the world. Unfortunately, Travamov concludes if the U.S. withdraws from the region, geopolitical rivals will expand. Russia will move into Ukraine, and China will expand in the South China Sea. Thus, there are 2 nuclear conflict scenarios that will erupt post-American withdrawal. First is Ukrainian invasion. Stanionovas 19 of the Foreign Policy reports that Russia has always wanted to take control of Ukraine as it both secure pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine and also block the country's Euro-Atlantic integration. Moreover, Model 18 of the Atlantic Council explains that although the faltering Russian economy cannot sustain a war, Putin cannot fathom the prospect of a good war going bad because he believes Russia is strong. Worse, in a bid to strengthen his legitimacy, his inner circle would easily convince him that a quick strike is imperative. Unfortunately, Model continues that if Russia invaded Ukraine, tens of thousands would die. Ultimately, the U.S. would get involved, prolonging the war and separating Russia from the international economy. Economic disaster from the war would cause state failure within Russia. Fisher 15 of Vox furthers that a Ukrainian invasion would likely become a larger conflict, concluding that a small war would escalate to nuclear conflict because of Russia's low bar for nuclear weapon use and because Putin is more dangerous than any Soviet leader since Stalin. Second is the South China Sea. Romanov 19 of the Japan Times indicates that China's goal is to expand militarily and economically into the South China Sea with the end goal of regional domination. Unfortunately, Owens 19 of the National Interest finds that China's expansion into the South China Sea threatens the U.S. core economic and security interests, leading America to increase its military position and strengthen orders to combat China. Problematically, Kulaki 16 of the UCS explains that the lack of trust between the two could lead to the U.S. or China to inadvertently escalate skirmishes to large military confrontations, concluding that one could launch a retaliatory nuclear strike if the other were to launch a conventional one. Overall, Bresson 17 of Forbes quantifies that even a limited nuclear exchange would set off a global famine that would kill 2 billion people and effectively end human civilization by creating nuclear winter that blocks all sunlight. Thus we negate.
Okay, can everyone hear me all right? Is anyone not ready? We affirm Americans' foreign policy strategy in the Middle East resembles a yo-yo. Goldenberg 18 explains that we intervene for years and we completely leave the region when we fear that we have overstepped. However, this sparks political outcry amongst people who see problems forming, which forces the U.S. to send another major intervention into the Middle East, creating the yo-yo effect. As a result, the stage is set for a dramatic conflict. Segel 19 confirms that the conditions are ripe and the probability of an all-out war in the Middle East breaking out in a number of places are at historic highs. Fortunately, Moore writes 1 month ago that America's best shot to stop the yo-yo and prevent a forever war in the Middle East is in a total withdrawal of U.S. troops, but rather keeping a small, predictable presence that will satisfy the public's concerns while also supporting partners in the region. Specifically, removing nearly all of our military presence puts a stop to this perpetual conflict in two areas. Contention one is the proxy problem. The Middle East is being torn apart by never-ending Iranian-Saudi proxy struggle in areas such as Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Bahrain, and Yemen. Fortunately, affirming puts an end to the proxy problem in two ways. First is ending overconfidence. Our military presence gives unwavering confidence to our currently reckless allies. Tabata 18 explains that Saudi Arabia has fallen extremely reliant on the US for backup, with our support being the only driver of their continued aggressive policies. Dangerously, Parsi 20 reports that this protection has enabled Saudi Arabia to fund proxy terrorist groups and continue destabilizing activities in the region against Iran. Second is through diplomacy. Parsi continues that last year, when the US appeared to back out of the region, regional diplomacy, particularly among Saudi Arabia and Iran, and de-escalation followed as they can no longer act recklessly. For example, Saudi Arabia began negotiations with the Houthi rebels that eased tensions in Yemen and brought the number of Yemeni civilians killed by airstrikes to zero. However, because we continue to stay, Parsi concludes that the region is once more moving towards conflict and the early signs of diplomatic progress achieved during the preceding months have vanished. Overall, putting an end to proxy conflicts can save millions of lives. In just two places, Fisher 16 reports that the current stalemate in Syria has already killed over 400,000 people, and Lynch 19 quantifies that 482,000 people are estimated to die in Yemen if the war continues through 2022, and 1.8 million in 2030. Even worse, the Small Wars Journal furthers that the proxy wars are reaching a boiling point where they can easily break out into an all-out war between Iran and Saudi Arabia as they continuously ease up closer to their borders. Contention 2 is Iran. Al Jazeera 20 reports that as long as we keep our troops in the region, tensions will continue to increase and make miscalculation extremely likely, resulting in a full-blown war between the US and Iran. Specifically, our military presence has set us on a crash course with Iran towards inevitable conflict in two ways. First is escalation. Rohi 20 explains that Washington's aggressive policy approach against Iran has started a series of escalatory moves and counter-moves. The Shara 19 explains that these actions empower Iranian hardliners who encourage militarism and pressure Iran to destabilize the US, inevitably evoking a violent reaction from the US. DePetros 20 concludes that removing our military presence from Iran's reach would be the biggest step towards de-escalation because it now only provides a shooting target for Iran to pick on and another source of tensions in the region. Second is inhibiting the multilateral GCC. The GCC, or Gulf Cooperation Council, was established in 1981 with the purpose of achieving cooperation and unity. Unfortunately, at least 20 reports that despite having significantly more advanced armed forces and over 11 times the amount of military expenditure, the GCC has been unable to effectively combat Iranian challenges due to internal fracturing. Young 20 explains that our maximum pressure campaign created bilateral talks with individual states, but weakened the multilateral GCC and by definition undercut the united front against Iran, concluding that there is simply no more trust between the Gulf states. Indeed, Ashford 18 concludes that as long as America remains the strongest force in the region, the GCC will continue to continuously fail to form alliances that they would have otherwise. This is the best path to peace, as Fontaine Rose writes 2 weeks ago, that escalation will inevitably result in conflict as Iranian hardliners mistrust and block negotiations with the US. Fortunately, the GCC is the one organization that could be the hero and form negotiations because it shares interests with Iran and has much more to lose. For example, Long 19 adds that Gulf states like Oman are uniquely positioned to diffuse regional tensions as they actually maintain close ties with Iran and trust each other. For these reasons, Valesco 17 quantifies that regional organizations like the GCC are 6.7 times better at forming lasting peace agreements compared to outside actors. The overall impact is preventing war. Haltlanger 20 finds that a conventional war with Iran would kill hundreds of thousands of people, reverberate across the Middle East, and draw in great powers such as China and Russia, with the result being mass devastation. Thus, we affirm.
Before cross, can we see the seagull evidence in the yo-yo thing? And then also the Small Wars journals.
And Roy.
Okay.
And Roy.
The top.
Yeah.
Okay, you said Segel. What else?
Seagull, Small War Journal, and Roy.
Wait, what Roy evidence?
Whatever you read at the top of the, like the first evidence that you read in yo-yo.
Oh, the Goldenberg evidence?
Yeah, sure. Oh, never mind. Can we see the last piece of evidence on yo-yo, the more evidence, I guess?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that one.
Okay. I just sent it.
We'll start prep when we get it. Okay, we got it. Starting now. $37 seconds used. Are you good for cross?
Yep.
Great. Okay, so on your first contention about like the proxy wars, doesn't if countries become less overconfident, doesn't that mean they move towards diplomacy?
What? Say again?
So
if they become less overconfident?
So you have to win your first warrant to link into your second warrant, right?
No, the argument is simply that when we, like right now, they have a lot of overconfidence because the United States is in the region. So when we end that, that means that they're no longer engaging in wars. And then that also, like the second link is that they start doing diplomacy.
Wait, so no, the argument is that when you stop US support, they don't become overconfident and then move towards diplomacy, right?
Well, no, they just stop fighting wars. Like they don't need to doing diplomacy.
So Saudi Arabia, your argument is that once the US pulls out, Saudi Arabia just backs away from Yemen and just sits at home and doesn't do diplomacy?
Yeah, that's the first link. And the second link is that they engage in diplomacy.
Okay, sure. You can have a question.
Okay, let's talk about global destabilization, right? So when the United States pulls out of, let's just say, Oman, why does that mean that all of a sudden Russia wants to take Ukraine?
It's specifically taking all our troops out from the Persian Gulf. For example, taking out of Saudi Arabia, taking out of Iraq, taking out of all these other countries is specifically us showing that we don't have our like other countries back anymore. Can I ask a question?
Wait, what? So why does that mean like Russia all of a sudden invades Ukraine?
The Travimov evidence says that our power in the region is a litmus test for US power globally because that's where we have so much power. So when we draw, Russia sees that they can expand because we're less on the global stage. Can I ask you a question?
Wait, hang on though. But like when Trump pulled out troops from Syria in 2018, did Russia expand into Ukraine? Like at all?
We had troops in Syria to try to respond to the civil war. We have troops in Saudi Arabia to try to we have an alliance with Saudi Arabia, which is why we have troops there.
Yeah, sure. And we have troops in Iraq to fight ISIS. Like we have troops in the Middle East for lots of different reasons. But when we pull out of Syria,
is that when you withdraw all the troops from our allies, that shows that we're decreasing commitment to our allies. Can I ask you a question?
Wait, no, but you didn't answer my question, right? So when the United States pulled troops out of Syria, did Russia expand or not?
I mean, Russia went into Syria more, but not like the argument isn't just pulling out of one country, it's pulling out of the entire region. Can I ask you a question?
Okay, sure.
Okay, so on your second contention about Iran, you say that, wait, so on your first one, is it the US escalating or Iran escalating?
US presence escalates like tensions on both sides.
So like the US military does stuff against Iran?
Not necessarily. It's that like, our presence there makes Iran more angry, and then we respond to their anger with more escalation.
Oh, so the US responds with more escalation and that causes war.
I mean, both sides can escalate. That's why it escalates instead of just being like one side doing things.
Okay, that's fine.
Escalation is. Okay, yeah, back on this Ukraine point. Why does Russia want Ukraine?
Russia wants Ukraine because they want to defend the pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine, but also they want to prevent Ukraine from integrating into like NATO and those.
Yeah, so it's because they want control of Ukraine.
That's fine.
So, wait, but if I'm a country, why would I nuke like another country that I want control over?
What? It's not them nuking Ukraine.
Who are they nuking?
It's the US and Russia getting pulled into a nuclear conflict.
Okay.
We'll run prep starting now. Another 45 used, so 37 plus 45, whatever that is.
Okay.
I have you a minute 40 left.
Sure, that works.
Okay, can everyone hear me all right? Okay. And starting with an overview that you can flow at the top of their case.
Wait, is the overview offensive or
Defensive.
defensive? Okay.
And there's some weighing in it too. Okay. In overview, 3 things. First, any link defense returns that we read on their entire case takes out any solvency on their case, because if one side doesn't want to come to the table, it doesn't matter if Saudi or Iran, Arabia or Iran wants to come to the table, since the other one doesn't. But then second of all, the status quo solves diplomacy. Kang 20 explains last week that it's possible that technical level discussion to court medical and scientific efforts to combat the coronavirus could open up much needed dialogue to medical dialogue for reducing tension in the region. This conflict and instability in the Middle East could turn the coronavirus crisis into an opportunity. The implication is that negating keeps the status quo and catalyzes long-term peace. If we win a risk that conflict escalates without the U.S., there is no peace. But then third, we short circuit their entire case, because if a conflict breaks out anywhere, there's no peace at all whatsoever, because the unique evidence from case explains the competition is existential. With that, go to their case. First, on yo-yo, 2 responses here. First, if immediately when we pull out, Saudi Arabia lashes out as per the Sunique and McInnes evidence, which indicates that since they view Iran on their border as an existential threat, this means that we outweigh on time frame, because before the U.S. can even come back into the resolution the region, the conflict was already started. But then second of all, Hannah 19 explains that the U.S. presence has remained relatively constant the entire time since the Middle East, and the yo-yo effect doesn't really exist. But then go to their case. An overall turn at the top will explain how it connects to their individual contentions and the implications at the bottom. Iran expands. This is for 2 reasons. First, Iraq. Pollock 19 of the Washington Institute writes that absent the U.S., Iran would expand to Iraq. The reason is because they would get a chance to evade sanctions by getting access to the biggest oil fields in the world from Iraq, meaning that they can be financially less burdened. But then second, Israel. Clausen 18 explains that Iran wants to expand against Israel to complete the Shia crescent, which leads Ehrenheim 19 to explain that if the U.S. were to withdraw, Iran would expand into Iraq to get to Israel. This has 2 implications. First, expanding proxy conflicts. Hubbard 19 for the New York Times explains that Iran can't currently fund its proxies because of sanctions, meaning that the expansion into Iraqi oil fields reignites their ability to fight proxy wars. That's important because Galb 17 for the ISIS explains that proxy wars last longer than interstate wars, because they on average kill double the amount of people than interstate wars. This means that we outweigh the U.S.-Iran war in time frame and magnitude, because the proxy war is worse because it lasts much longer, but it also means that we turn their contention, 1, because the allies have to engage with Iran in a proxy war. But then the second implication is that it kills the chance for diplomacy, because if Iran expands into Iraq, McInnes from case explains that the Saudis would fear an existential threat and would assuredly expand to their own proxy operations, thus killing the chance for peace. This also turns their GCC diplomacy warm, because no one's going to do diplomacy during a conflict. With that, go to the contention 1 about emboldening allies. 2 major responses here. First, we can turn against it because Luck 18 for the CSM explains that if domestic dissenters see that the U.S. security leadership is disintegrating, the Saudis will grow skeptical of the existing leadership, potentially challenging the prince. That's why Lynch 16 for the Carnegie Endowment continues that with domestic audiences questioning policy failures, the Saudis would start a proxy war to distract regional domestic audiences. This outweighs their yo-yo, because even if they're going to diplomacy right now, the security guarantee is still in place, which means that the public is still reassured. However, our world is indicative without the United States. But then second of all, Katalis explains that right now, the U.S. and the Saudi-Iran negotiations are because of fears of U.S.-Iran escalation, not because of the lack of a U.S. security guarantee. Prefer our empirics because of this, because Goldenberg says that historically, whenever the security guarantee goes down, Saudi Arabia expands. With that, go to their contention 2 about Iran. On their first link about the U.S., first, the United World International 20 explains that despite officials pushing aggression on Iran due to the coronavirus in Iran, the Pentagon has resisted, and the Trump did not listen, fearing that the strikes against Iran against the backdrop of the coronavirus could negatively affect the image of the U.S. But then secondly, you can turn it, because Memory 20 explains that before the Soleimani strike, Iran escalated proxy conflicts with impunity. However, now the U.S. military responses forced them to go to the negotiating table. But then second, on their second link about bilateral diplomacy, you can turn it, because Pollock 19 for the Washington Institute explains that if we were to pull our commitments in the region, our allies would become frightened and over-exaggerate the Iranian threat, causing them to tackle problems that are beyond their capabilities and exacerbating conflict. This has 2 implications. First, there's more proxy conflicts because and we outweigh on scope here because the entire GCC is involved rather than just Saudi Arabia and Iran. But then second of all, there's no diplomacy because you can prefer our evidence here that their Ashford evidence is only indicative of a world before U.S. involvement, and that is literally the 1950s. Prefer our empirics, which says that they would literally expand because they have such an existential threat, and you can outweigh this term because this is much better than their their leads evidence because their leads evidence assumes the security guarantee is there. Ultimately, without the security guarantee, everything changes. None of their evidence is indicative of that. Negate.
Can we see that the U.S. military presence has remained relatively constant and that the yo-yo effect doesn't exist? The second response at the top.
Yeah.
I also see the coronavirus, the second thing you read in the overview. Also, did you read that from a doc or no? Because I didn't catch some of this stuff. I was just wondering if you like had it written out.
Yeah, it's from a doc. Do you want me to like the
Ye-
card is like it's basically directly from the card, so I can just like the card will.
It's just the first part of Hannah that says like military presence hasn't really changed. And then Arjun sent Kane.
When y'all get it, just let us know. Did you get it?
Yeah, I just got it. We'll take some prep to read it now.
Okay, starting.
All right, we're good.
We use 10 seconds.
What was the third response you read in the overview?
Short circuit.
Yeah, like what does that mean?
Oh, it's just like if any conflict happens, we short circuit diplomacy.
Gotcha. Okay, Abraham, would you like to take some prep time now?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay, get on our call.
Starting now.
Okay, we're good.
We used a minute 30 total.
Okay.
Wait, Daniel, can you mute the phone?
Yeah, I just did that. All right. Is everyone ready? Okay, cool. Start start on our case. Their first overview says that if they block negotiations on both sides, that's fine. It doesn't matter. The second response says that coronavirus is happening right now. However, this is completely short term. And second of all, this isn't interactive with our GCC argument because it's talking about the United States. Third of all, they say that conflict breaks out decrease in negotiations. That doesn't matter because conflict is inherently short term. If we solve for long term war that has higher magnitude, we're definitely going to outweigh. Now let's go to their a couple of their. Now let's go to the yo-yo effect. First of all, they say that their arguments immediately lash out. That is literally our argument. Our argument is that defending the status quo is fluctuations of commitment, which means that their hair trigger arguments are going to happen. But second of all, they say that it's remaining constant. Their evidence saying that's remaining constant is only under the Trump administration. Is going to change in literally just like 4 years if Trump can't win a third election, for example. Now let's go to their turns. They say that Iran is going to invade into like Iraq and Israel. You can actually turn this argument because Eisenstein 2015 finds that our large presence had no effect in successfully deterring Iran from using proxy groups nor intervening, which means that their argument is empirically done out. However, you can turn it because Mousavian 2014 finds that Iran strategy is offensive with their primary goal being regime survival, not expansion. However, Mousavian furthers that our aggressive stance has strengthened radicalism in Iran, where hostile U.S. policies have justified Iran's threat against threat policies, where the hardliners are capable of rallying the people for violent confrontations. They say that they want to invade into Iraq for helping their economy. We would argue it would hurt Iran's economy more if they're investing more into the military aspirations. But secondly, we'd argue that they get more like sanctions placed on them. This doesn't make sense. But also, we would argue that they wouldn't even invade into Israel because they would just get nuked by Israel. Now, on our argument about Saudi Arabia, this is their case. I'll respond there. Now let's go to our argument about Iran. The first thing that they say is the Pentagon has resisted movement. This doesn't even matter because our argument is that it's going to inadvertent escalation into a conflict. Secondly, they say that the proxy conflicts are starting have decreased. However, the Peters 20 evidence really evaluates the Soleimani strikes and finds that after the Soleimani strikes, Iran has literally sent proxy forces to attack our bases in Iraq. Now let's go to our second contention, second argument of inhibiting the GCC. All they say is the allies are going to over-exaggerate. That doesn't respond to our argument because they conceded at least 20 evidence that finds that our allies are completely more advanced and have 11 times the military expenditure of Iran, which means that they're not going to over-exaggerate. And they also try to indict evidence that we don't even read in our case. It doesn't make sense at all. The Ashford 18 evidence also goes conceded that finds the Long 19 evidence goes conceded that finds that states like Oman would actually prevent the conflict that they talk about because they have close ties with Iran, but they wouldn't want the conflict. Let's go to their case. On their contention about Saudi Arabia and Iran, there's a couple problems here. First, Tunia in 2015 finds that Saudi Arabia's scheme, like they talk about, is actually just to increase regional hegemony and not contain Iran. For example, the example that they cite, for example, the Yemen war, Saudi Arabia literally intervened in Yemen before Iran was even in the region. Secondly, we would argue that Saudi Arabia always views their security as more important. For example, we would argue that they're not going to start more conflicts if the United States security guarantee isn't even there. They would obviously know that they would lose these proxy conflicts. This is why all of their examples that they talk about in their case have literally happened in the past. Let's go to their contention too about global destabilization. Once again, a lot of problems. First of all, the credibility of the United States is very short term. Each administration has different policies, and they can't rely on the administration to have these same policies. Second of all, Tang in 2005 finds that our allies in different areas would always assume the worst case mindset. For example, they will know that the United States will intervene eventually, and they're not going to risk it. But third of all, past empirics disprove their argument because, for example, Obama's red line in Syria should have triggered their argument. But fourth, Stephen Walt, who's a very well-respected author from Harvard, finds that enemies want to assume we have worse resolve in South China Sea or Ukraine. For example, our interest in situation in Ukraine and South China Sea are totally different. If we pull out of the Middle East for different reasons, then they wouldn't believe that we're pulling out of different areas, and they wouldn't believe that our resolve is decreasing in these different conflicts like they talk about. But you can actually turn the argument because McDonald in 2011 finds that great powers make commitments of varying degrees that are functionally dependent on one another. Concessions in one area are not seen as influencing a commitment in another area. Far from being perceived as interdependent great power, commitments are often seen as being rivalrous, with that abandoning commitments in one area may actually bolster the strength of a commitment in another area. Retreat in an area retreat in an area of lesser importance, freed up resources, and signaled a stronger commitment to another area of greater dependence, greater significance. On their argument of a Ukrainian invasion, Russia has literally no capability to expand. Their economy is literally doing terrible right now. Let's go to their argument about the South China Sea. They say that it threatens U.S. interests. There's absolutely no warrant right in case. But secondly, Lian in 2017 finds there's multiple checkbacks. For example, China has really constrained military operations right now, which means that they wouldn't be able to militarily expand. Second of all, China and the United States are economically interdependent, which means that they would never explore. Third of all, China and the United States have diplomats talking literally every single day. They would never fear a conventional strike being a nuclear strike. They would just talk it out like the day it's shot or something.
Can we see McDonald?
Oh, also Toonie.
Sorry, where was Toonie read? Oh, okay. I got it.
Toonie, I had it as the first response on our contention one.
Yeah. Okay, let me know if you get the card that I just sent you.
Is it McDonald?
Yeah,
Okay.
and then I'll pull up the other one, but you can read that one first.
When we get it, we'll get it. Oh, I think I got it. Is
Starting.
the one that it, yeah, okay.
Yeah,
found
we got it. Starting now. That's 45 used. We're just waiting for the other card now.
Okay, let me know when you guys get it. I think I sent it like a minute ago.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay.
Okay, got
Okay.
it. Okay. Cross.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk about your GCC warrant. You keep going for this idea that Oman can foster peace. How can Oman overcome the existential crisis between Saudi Arabia and Iran during peace talks?
Why would you say it's an why would you say it's an existential crisis? Like,
That's what
if
Sadiq McInnes and Goldenberg say.
so if our argument is that if Saudi Arabia or if the United States backs out of the region, for example, all of these groups and all of these countries are going to form together. Saudi Arabia no longer sees Iran as an existential crisis because now the GCC as the entirety is the deterrent effect.
But how does like the GCC, okay, the GCC is a deterrent right now, right? Like
No, that's not true because the GCC is fractured right now.
Definitionally is an anti-Iranian influence organization. That's what its purpose is.
Okay, yes, I agree that the GCC is an anti-Iranian thing. That is our narrative. Our narrative is that bilateral talks with the United States like ruptured the multilateral front that the GCC is meant to do.
What bilateral talks with the US are happening now?
Sure. So our Young 20 evidence finds that the United States' presence in the region encourages those GCC countries to work with the United States. As a result, they don't work with each other because the problem with the GCC is that they have ideological differences.
How do we know? Okay, sure. Even if that's true, how do we know that even if the US wasn't there, that they would go back to negotiating with Iran?
Right. So our Ashford 18 evidence indicates that their security, which they feel. Yeah. Okay. So you agree that Iran is an existential threat, right? Insofar as that is true, those countries would believe that their ideological differences right now are less important than their security. They would treat their security as the #1 issue, which is why they would form together.
We both agree that it's an existential threat, right?
Sure. To like the individual countries, not to the entire GCC. Like to clarify, not to the GCC, but to the individual countries.
Okay, that's fine. You can have a question.
All right, sure. So in your argument about like Ukrainian invasion, why would it escalate to nuclear war?
Because Putin is super confident in his abilities, that the Russian economy is strong enough to fight a war when in reality it isn't. And that would cause the US to intervene and basically cause Russian state collapse as per the modal evidence. And because of that, Russia would lash out super aggressively and cause the United States and it to go into war.
So if you know that the United States is going to re-intervene, then why doesn't Russia know that they're also going to get blown out of the face?
The modal evidence frontlines that. It says that Putin cannot physically comprehend the idea of a good war going bad because he like is he's so convinced in Russian like nationalism.
Right. So you're a high school debater can, but the president
Not,
of Russia
no,
can.
This is directly from Modal, which is an analyst from the Atlantic Council. It's not me saying it.
Wait, so why does this analyst that you're talking about, why is he able to
Do you want? It's a she, by the way.
Oh, okay. So why does this analyst understand that Russia is going to get blown out of the face of the earth, but Russia themselves
like
doesn't
see
understand
it
that?
all the time, right? Like they intervened in Crimea, thinking that they were gonna like not have any international sanctions when the exact opposite happened. Like they are like very emboldened in their capabilities, and that's pretty much time.
Okay, sure. I think that's it across though.
And we see the Musabi argument from your Iran front lines.
Yeah, sure. I just sent them. Let me know when you get it.
Sorry, what did you say? We didn't hear that.
I just sent the card. Let me know when you get it.
Okay. We got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
Edina, what's your order?
The order is going to be our second contention back to our first contention, AF. Is everyone good? Good? Okay. Start on our second contention about global destabilization. They try to read these terms about how it's actually going to like decrease conflict and this McDonald turn, extend their defense that says none of these conflict scenarios are ever going to escalate. Go to our first contention about regional domination, about proxy conflicts. They read two responses. First, they say that Saudi Arabia only expands because of regional hegemony. Two responses here. The first is our argument is that the U.S. currently holds them back from going towards hegemony and they don't need to expand. But second, our 2C evidence is very clear in saying that Saudi Arabia believes that they're the last Arab country stopping Iran, which is why if the U.S. pulls out, they have to expand and stop Iran. Their second argument is that they're always going to prioritize their security. Yes, that's why our argument. That's why we say they need to expand once the U.S. leaves to ensure their security. That's why the McInnes evidence explains that when the U.S. leaves, they need to fund more proxy groups to prevent Iran from going on their border, which is their main security threat. That's why you can extend the McInnes evidence, which is the clearest in Iran that explains when the U.S. leaves, Saudi Arabia feels that they need to contain Iran themselves and they begin to expand and fund more proxy groups. That's why the Goldenberg evidence that is conceded explains empirically when the U.S. reduces presence in the region, Saudi Arabia lashes out and they intervened in Syria, Bahrain, and Yemen. That links to our impact that comes from the ECFR that explains that Saudi Arabia and Iran could escalate to 5 conflicts that will kill 42 million people. Then let's go to their case. At the top, on the overview, they have conceded that any risk of Saudi Arabia or Iran or any country escalating in the region delinks their entire case because if one side doesn't come to the diplomacy table, diplomacy doesn't work. On the Kane argument, they say that it's short-term and it's because of the United States. Our Kane evidence is really explicit that says because of Corona, it has the opportunity for long-term diplomacy because countries are now negotiating with Iran in the status quo. The only thing that changes is if the U.S. leaves the region and destabilizes it and causes Iran to expand and Saudi Arabia to expand, which means the status quo is solving for all their diplomacy arguments. On the yo-yo argument, they say on our Hannah argument that it's only under Trump. They have no contextualization of their arguments or the yo-yo argument post-Trump, which is why our Hannah evidence is the best in the round that explains that the military presence stays relatively the same, which means that the yo-yo effect really doesn't matter. Then let's go to the Luck and Lynch turn first. They say it's a cross-operative case. It isn't, which means they've essentially conceded the argument. The Luck evidence explains that Saudi Arabia's stability collapses when the U.S. leaves the region, which is why the Lynch evidence explains that to go away from domestic issues, they distract with starting new conflicts. They have conceded the weighing on this argument. The first is that Saudi Arabia doesn't do diplomacy, which delinks all of their arguments, but B, it is unique to a world without the United States that Saudi Arabia begins to lash out and their evidence doesn't indicate so. Then on the Iran expansion turn. They say that Iran is expanding because of the United States, but they don't address two of the warrants why they would expand independent of whether the United States is in the region. The first is the Pollock evidence that explains that they want to get more money from Iraqi oil fields, but second is the Clausen evidence that explains that they want to create the Shia Crescent to defend against Israel, which means that they're going to expand once the U.S. leaves, which is why the Hubbard evidence explains that there would be new proxy conflicts when the U.S. leaves the region, and they have conceded the weighing that comes from Gauss that explains that proxy conflicts are the most important impact in round because proxy conflicts have more deaths than interstate conflict because it lasts longer. But even then, let's go to their last argument about the GCC. They're essentially going for this single Ashford evidence, but they miss the Pollock evidence that explains our allies are going to freak out and start new conflicts. They just say that they're militarily superior, so they're not going to.
Let's start now. You were like 320, so.
Yeah, my bad.
Okay, we're gonna start taking prep now.
I've got that as y'all's prep.
Okay, I'm gonna start on our argument about the GCC. Then I'm gonna do a lot of weighing, and then I'm gonna go to their turns on our case, or like starting off on like their overview, I guess, and then yeah, starting on their like just so it's gonna be GCC weighing, then down our case, then on their argument. Is everyone ready? Our argument about the GCC is really easy to vote on. The only thing he says is way over time, and it's that they just won't actually do it, and it's just the exact opposite of our claim. But Daniel frontlines this in rebuttal when he says at least 20 fines. That the only reason why the GCC isn't working right now, and that they have much more advanced military spending and stuff like that, the only reason it's not working is because the United States forms bilateral agreements with each of the individual countries, but overall undermines the unity of the entirety of the GCC, which is why it's failing right now. Our Ashford evidence finds that as long as the United States is the strongest force in the region, the GCC will continue to fail. This evidence goes conceded. This is really important because Fontenrose finds that escalation in the status quo from 2 weeks ago will lead to conflict as Iranian continues to block negotiations, but Long 19 finds that as states like Oman have close ties with Iran so they can diffuse the situation and ultimately create this multilateral solution. This is key because our Valesco evidence finds that regional organizations are 6.7 times better at forming long-lasting peace agreements than outside forces, and Holtmanger finds that a conventional war between US and Iran will kill hundreds of thousands and bring in other actors, which leads to a nuclear war which will kill 2 billion people. This obviously outweighs their case on magnitude. But then let's do more weighing. First, the obvious most piece of weighing is that the GCC will literally solve back every single one of their arguments, because every single one of their arguments is fundamentally predicated on the fact that when the United States pulls out of the region, Saudi Arabia feels scared and somehow starts doing something, or other countries feel scared and they start doing things. But that doesn't exist because the GCC now makes them feel secure because they're now part of a multilateral agreement, and this is more likely than them starting random conflicts, because when someone's actually facing an existential threat, like they themselves concede you to, they're not going to start starting random conflicts. They're not going to try to start a war with that existential threat. No, they're going to try to say a multilateral solution to solve that threat. Their argument is completely ahistoric and makes absolutely zero sense when you think about the incentive structure debate. Furthermore, we'd say that this war outweighs for a few other reasons. Number one, because we're leading to lasting peace instead of just one or two conflicts. We're linking to like long-term peace negotiations with solves into the future, which obviously outweighs on scope. Secondly, on probability, because this war is inherently more probable than any of the other wars because the U.S. and Iran have already escalated to such high tensions at the beginning of 2020. But third, it literally links into their proxy argument because Iran will only fund more proxy groups in a war with the U.S. because they're going to try to get as many united fronts against the United States as possible, which means that funding for proxies will only increase in their world. Furthermore, we obviously outweigh on magnitude because it's a global nuclear war. Let's address their overview. They say that we need all actors. We're obviously solving for all actors because we're controlling for the incentive structure. They obviously don't want to get nuked by Iran. And they say that long-term diplomacy negotiations with Iran, and like when the United States leaves, Saudi Arabia and Iran expand. No, we're telling you the war happens between U.S. and Iran. Like it's not a regional war. Like archaic evidence furthermost on their coronavirus thing literally says that it's just like an opportunity for everyone to expand and take unnecessary risks. So there's no offense or defense off of this for them. Then on their turn about Saudi Arabia like being more skeptical and starting more proxies, again, the GCC solves. If there's regional organizations, they won't just start more proxies. Their argument doesn't make any sense at all on the war level. Then they say that like Iran's going to expand, but they missed the front line that number one, Iran is inherently defensive, so they're not going to take an offensive stance. Number two, they're not actually going to do it. They're only the hardliners are pushing for their stance right now. So when the hardliners are disengaged, that means that won't actually happen. We turn their turn. They don't actually enact with us furthermore. And then furthermore, we'd say that if they invented other countries, they get more sanctions. So that actually that's three reasons why that won't happen. They have no offense off this. Then on their case, we always say that the GCC solves. Saudi Arabia won't engage in more proxy wars or won't start any conflict on their side because the GCC now makes them feel safe, so they don't need to worry about that. And then furthermore, we tell you that security is the most important thing, so that obviously they wouldn't just start more wars. Are y'all ready for Grand?
Yeah. Can I ask the first question?
Yeah.
Okay. So wait, so how does the GCC solve back for US-Iran war?
Because there's no more escalation between the United States and Iran.
So if the GCC is collected now, how does that prevent the US from escalating with Iran?
No, so the uniqueness evidence we read from Fontenrose says that negotiations in the region are not working with the United States either because they're blocking negotiations because they don't share the same interests.
No, the GCC is independent from US-Iran negotiations. The US and Iran can do negotiations without the GCC, right?
Wait, but you also conceded the Fontenrose evidence. Like, I guess if you're trying to make the argument that it's separate, the fact that you conceded this other argument, I guess, is just more offense for us.
I'm just not seeing the link between having the GCC unified and preventing a US-Iran war.
Sure, because
no longer expands and no longer takes risks, which means the US doesn't escalate.
Wait, so you have to win that the GCC does diplomacy with Iran, which prevents Iran from expanding, which prevents the US from responding. That's your link?
That's our
no,
argument.
it's just making Iran more peaceful in general.
How does that de-escalate a U.S.-Iran war though? Like if the U.S. leaves
because any sort of war to take place, there needs to be escalation on both sides. So if you diffuse Iran's escalations, then there's not going to be a war.
So the link is GCC de-escalates Iranian escalation, which de-escalates US escalation.
The point is just to make fun of our link like way too far late in the debate. Then like
it wasn't.
You didn't really explain the linking case. You can have a question though.
Right. Well, I mean, the Fontenrose evidence is just completely conceded, so we're still winning uniqueness that a US-Iran war is going to happen.
You can have a question.
So when a country faces an existential threat, are they more likely to start conflicts with that existential threat, or are they more likely to pursue negotiations?
Conflict.
Why?
That's what Goldenberg, McInnes, and Sunique say, all of which
Sure, but like, what's the warranting behind that? Like,
the warranting is because since it's an existential threat, since they no longer have the security guarantee anymore, they view it as Iran is going to somehow attack them, which means that they go into the northern border with Iraq and military.
No. So okay. Let me rephrase that, right? So if they know it's an existential threat, why would they ever engage in a war that they know they're going to lose?
Saudi Arabia doesn't think that they would lose the war because they're funding proxy groups in other areas.
Okay.
They're literally giving money to proxy groups.
Okay, so engaging. Okay, sure. So engaging with an existential.
They don't engage with existential threats because they don't trust the existential threat. That's why Saudi Arabia and Iran don't normally do diplomacy. The only scenario that they do diplomacy is in the status quo.
Okay, 42 million people dying seems like the entire region gets entangled and that those countries would somehow like also get destroyed. So I don't think your like impact, I think your impact is like disproving your argument about like small proxies fighting with each other. But we would contend that insofar as it is this existential threat, like you pinned it out to be, they would have to try diplomacy first. Because if they went to war, they would instantly know that they would lose. Or they would both know that they would lose ground in like the war.
Fight Iranian proxy forces, which is why our impact is proxy wars killing 42 million people.
It's not Saudi Arabia.
Right, but it's in those regions though. It's in those regions. Like 42 million people are just not the small proxy groups.
For example, the Yemen conflict, right? It's not Saudi Arabia and Iran directly doing it in one of those countries.
Yeah, but we also turn your turn on Iranian proxies, so we win that too.
Okay. Well, yeah.
Okay. Now we're out. the weighing is just short circuit, right? Oh yeah. Okay, the order is going to be the overview, then our case, then weighing, which will be their weighing and our weighing, and then their case. Is everyone good with that? Okay. Start on the overview. Even if everything else in the round is super messy, you can still vote on the Kane evidence, which indicates that because of coronavirus, that is the first opportunity for there to be long-term peace. What this means in the round is that we don't even need to think about what happens after you affirm or negate the resolution, because negating the resolution inherently means that we're going to peace, which means that their GCC warrant doesn't even matter, and we short-circuit it before it even happens because we ensure that peace happens. If you want to vote on peace, at least vote right there on the negative. They have no substantive response to this in summary. With that, let's go to our case. They don't extend any meaningful responses to it in summary. With that, let's go to the link. Sunique explains that when the United States commitment decreases, Saudi Arabia aggression increases. This is because the Sunique evidence indicates that Iran challenges Saudi Arabia and is willing to respond to any change. The 2C evidence is very clear in saying that Saudi leaders think that they are the last Arab country to fight Iran and thus won't do diplomacy, which is why McKinnon says that if they were challenged, they would go directly to fight Iranian proxies by funding their own proxies. That links to the NRC, which explains that it would cause 5 new conflicts to erupt and 42 million people to die. They say a few things. First, they say that they prereq because of diplomacy solving war. But no, first of all, they dropped the Goldenberg evidence, which indicates that in the past, every single time this has happened, there hasn't been diplomacy. They've only been more emboldened further. Then they say lasting peace. Nope, we link it through the Kane evidence. But then third of all, they talk about probability, but they drop the UWI evidence, which I'll talk about later. And fourth of all, they talk about how there's a Lincoln because there's more proxies, but the status quo solves. We don't even need to think about that. With that, let's go to their case. There are 3 major arguments to be made here. First of all, they drop the impact defense from the UWI, which explains that even if the military commanders want to go to war, Trump and the Pentagon don't, which is why the escalation is stopping right now. They don't have an impact. But then second of all, they literally drop a turn the entire round. The Luck and Lynch evidence literally indicates that because Saudi Arabia has to quell domestic audiences, they are going to expand. This outweighs any of their diplomacy scenarios because diplomacy can't solve for internal Saudi fracturing. Well, what that means for the round is because even if diplomacy happens with the GCC, it doesn't matter because Saudi Arabia still expands. But then, which means that even if the GCC would solve for the rest of the tensions, Saudi Arabia still expands with the rest of Iran, which links to the impact, which links to our impact from case, which means that ultimately, since they're dropping the turn, there's no offense there.
All right. Is everyone ready? It's gonna start. Okay, this is kind of going to be messy. It's gonna start on, I guess, their case first, and then it's gonna go like I have the coronavirus and stuff at like the bottom of their case, so we'll just talk about that after their case. All right, is everyone ready?
Wait, could you repeat that?
Yeah, so it's just gonna go. It's gonna go their case.
I believe I was the last judge to decide if everyone could make sure that they are back here for the decision.
All right, so since I squirreled, I think that means I give the first decision. So this round felt super messy on the
I don't
floor
think
for
they
me.
know the decision yet.
Oh,
You have to
Okay.
tell them the decision first.
Sorry about that. Yeah. All right. So congratulations to both teams for making it this far. Runoffs at the TOC is super cool. It was ultimately a 2-1 decision for the con and I squirreled for the pro. So basically, as I was saying before, this round felt kind of messy on the flow for me. I don't know if it was like the funky roadmaps or like the cross applications, but I mean, I'm positive that I have stuff missing. And I think that also if I was trying to check everything in the final focuses to see if this was something that was like in summary or beforehand, I'd have never come to a decision. So starting out on the uniqueness debate, I thought that this was kind of not done well by either side. For instance, like by the end of the round, I'm not sure if the status quo is trending towards peace or not. I think the UWI card that comes out in first final focus from rebuttal is like kind of blippy, but also like doesn't get engaged with by the AF in terms of the US-Iran war. But also in like terms of the coronavirus, I think that neg doesn't put enough ink on AF's claim that like a US-Iran war would like shut that down, would like affect that in first final. To be clear, like AF, a lot of the other responses that you put on coronavirus though in second final focus definitely like needed to be there sooner, preferably in summary. So then after that, I guess I'm not really sure what the status quo is going to look like. I guess it's, so what AF does tell me that goes mostly uncontested though, is that if the United States gets out of there, the GCC is likely going to become formed and be, I guess, better at doing peace. The question then becomes is whether or not countries like Saudi Arabia are going to comply with that. I guess, but for what it's worth on my flow / trying to finally come to a decision, I think that AF just more cleanly carries through that Saudi Arabia would like no longer have a reason to like attack other countries, and Iran would also just like go back to being on the defensive now that the US wasn't there and like maybe not have a war. So that was just where I voted.
Thank you.
Eddie, do you want to go? Do you want me to go?
I'd go next, doesn't matter though.
Okay, fine, go ahead.
Okay. I think I have similar frustrations to Kate. The round is pretty messy. I think that I end up resolving the major area that Kate talks about in the other direction, which leads to the differing in the ballot for me. I think ultimately I make a decision that I frame my ballot around that the creation of new conflict points is a worsening of the situation than the GCC's ability to solve the creation of new unpredictable things in the future, combined with the fact that I think that Saudi Arabia probably complies less than the affirmative would need to win that argument. That's kind of the major thing that helped me visualize other areas of the debate. A little bit more minorly though, I think that I'm giving a bit more credit to the status quo being more favorable than if I had been seeing the round much more in the affirmative lens. I think that there's decent work done throughout the debate that isn't discussed much, with unique opportunity for medical assistance and cooperation spilling over to regional cooperation that can de-escalate things. Yes, the situation we're in is short-term, but that doesn't mean that the ties that we create go away. So I don't necessarily, that's the only kind of answer that the negative has, or sorry, that the affirmative has to this argument. And the negative is trying to push this narrative pretty hard. I think that the most difficult area of the debate was on the discussion of Iran. This is where it gets most messy for me and more difficult for me to be able to trace through extensions and analysis and warrants from the affirmative. This might just be a fault of my style of judging, but even with you might be relying way too heavily on conceded parts and then just moving on to the locations of the debate that you want to focus on more, like you're weighing, which you do well, but you're missing the entire story a little bit more fully for me. And so while I think that the negative should be doing a little bit more and that they had more game in this area of the debate early on with talking about reasons why Iran would aggress even absent the United States, I think, however, that this is the less specific scenario that I have to be able to discuss. And sorry, yeah, to Saudi Arabia, I think that this area of the debates is more cleanly flowing to the negative side than that area for the affirmative. I think that the idea that the GCC covers all future problems here is not as specific as the way in which the negative is presenting their story. I think their Goldenberg piece of evidence is decent on this point, and that Saudi Arabia would continue to aggress absent the United States. This creating new areas of conflict, proxies, also probably undermines future GCC ability to solve for things as well. That's how I kind of frame my decision.
So yeah, I can pick up where Eddie left off. I voted on a couple of similar reasons. First of all, I am, and I guess maybe Eddie, we're coming from similar places. I'm not going to do the work for you required to navigate the Iran debate. I think there's too much there. I think that you start to hash a little bit of it out in some of the crossfires, but I don't think an actual debate proper that you do enough to really prove to me that there's something there. I think NEG has a huge window to really do something. But ultimately, I vote on status quo and Saudi Arabia risk. I think that the narrative could certainly be strengthened on both sides. I think that anytime that you go up to a final focus at the very end, Daniel, and say, hey, this is going to be messy, and then there's like crazy mess, that's a sign that the debate itself is messy. And really, I think there was a window for you to win the round had you just followed the outline of the previous final focus and maybe refuted all of those a little cleaner, because otherwise your responses to COVID and status quo are pretty blippy. I'm extending TOC, I'm extending Oldenburg. I wrote a little bit more about this in my RFD on the ballot, but I think that there's a pretty good risk that Saudi Arabia will create this chaos and will create these problems. And I also think that if I buy that the status quo is better, that even if GCC is a good narrative story, GCC is still hypothetical. And I think that NEG does a pretty good job portraying that their current benefits and the current status quo is better than the risk of this possible GCC solving, because I would have to ignore Saudi Arabia there too. So I think the round had some really great analysis. I think that as someone who hasn't judged a lot on this topic, that you all, and this is something to consider going forward in the rest of your rounds, specifically Edina, that you have to not take for granted that there still needs to be a story there, because you're really familiar with your evidence, you're really familiar with the arguments, but that shouldn't take away from the very core building blocks of what debate should be, which is you painting a picture of what your world looks like. And I think you do a better job of that in this round than AF, which is ultimately why I end up voting for you. But I still think you can make that a little cleaner to say, no, look, let me make this really clear. Here's what this looks like now. If you vote AF, here's what happens and here's why, and get out of some of the minutia that kind of catches up with all of you and is why it gets a little sloppy.
So I just have one question.
Yeah, if I could just say one quick thing that Megan articulated really well for me. For instance, university, if you are trying to weigh completely on status quo, US war with Iran, force me to frame my ballot through that lens instead of relying on that as uniqueness and quickly then moving on through the rest of the debate. You want to make me feel really uncomfortable not evaluating my decision through that first, and I am not compelled to feel that way after the final focus. So sorry for that interlude, but yeah, questions.
So I guess our strategy this round was to sort of do just what you said, right? Frame the round around that like war scenario, which is why we tried to weigh it in a whole bunch of different ways. So I was just wondering, was the weighing just not convincing on it, and also like the weighing on why a US-Iran war is the most important thing that was in both the back half speeches. Like I was just wondering how that was evaluated. And then furthermore, I was wondering about the evaluation of the internal warrant debate about like behind the Goldenberg evidence, like the internal warrant of whether or not Saudi Arabia would panic or whether or not they do diplomacy, like how that was resolved.
Well, I'll answer the first question, and either of you jump in. I think you said it in your own wording of the question, right? You were trying to weigh in a lot of different ways. I think the problem is we were having a hard time following exactly what way, at least for me, what way you wanted me to view that. It's almost like it was a little bit of a moving target where I couldn't exactly nail down how you wanted me to view that argument. And I think that it would be more helpful, and specifically for a debate like this that's really heavy in warrants and in, I mean, we're going second, third, tertiary lines of argumentation here, for you to pick one and paint that picture, blow it up, really frame the debate for us that way, as opposed to trying to see what sticks.
I mean, I guess so, sure.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Was the second question about Saudi Arabia not pushing towards negotiation absent the U.S.?
Yeah, so
I'm not
like,
sure.
the way
I think that area is clear from the negatives perspective here. Their Goldenberg piece of evidence is pretty good when U.S. backs down in the region that they've lashed out multiple different times in multiple different places, and that the first thing that they probably do is fear for their security before a third party, you know, the GCC group, is going to successfully demonstrate their capability of filling that security void in their mind. So they probably fund proxy wars in the short term, which then they're making an argument that takes out the GCC's credibility, or takes out the GCC's ability to kind of hold the region in cohesion.
It's interesting. I wrote that I had voted on the extension of the Goldenberg card before I even read it, which was interesting because I had submitted my RFD and then Eddie called for the card, and then I read it and I'm like, I mean, I bought Meg's interpretation of it. I didn't know that I needed to read the card to see that, but that's what I will add, is that my understanding from Meg's interpretation of the Goldenberg card and the clean extension of it was that it's exactly what I was expecting it to say when I read it after Eddie had called for it while I was sitting here waiting.
Okay, well, I guess the way that we viewed the round was like to try to control like the reasons why Saudi Arabia would either expand further or pursue diplomacy. So then beyond just the Goldenberg evidence, what do you think would be more convincing on that level of the debate? Like on the internal warrant level, beyond just like what their evidence says or what our evidence says? Like what's the best way in which to compare the different arguments?
Yeah, I don't think that I really have, I have a lot of good blanket statements about why the GCC, or at least entities of it, of a similar like regional nature, are 6 times better at negotiating than outside third party, like whatever. I don't know why that's specifically the case in Saudi Arabia, and I think they're giving specific reasons related to Saudi Arabia that like maybe the GCC is a good thing in the abstract or in abstract situations, but they are giving specific warrants to Saudi Arabia. Like, I think the thing that you're saying you did, they did better. I don't know how you did that specifically.
I think even if you can just connect GCC to Saudi Arabia more directly, that helps us, right? I think it's me intervening if I am connecting Saudi Arabia to GCC in the way that you're suggesting now, because I don't think that's clearly happening in round.
Okay, so I guess
at least it's not on my flow.
The way that we tried to approach it was saying that Saudi Arabia would obviously pursue diplomacy because no country, when faced with an existential threat, would start conflicts with that existential threat. Like that's just a recipe for disaster. So do you think if we made that analysis more clear in response to their arguments from case and also their turn, do you think that would have been more persuasive than what we had done?
Yeah, but I still don't, I agree. Sorry, Megan, to
no, you're good.
Then I don't think that you are referencing an argument specific to Saudi Arabia there. You're just referencing like realist thought in general, and they are making an argument based upon predicated or like historical precedents that Saudi Arabia, absent the United States, does feel the need to divert Iran's interest by engaging in proxy wars in other places to take their eye off of taking over Saudi Arabia. Like that, what you're saying is not something that is specific to Saudi Arabia, and they are.
So then how should we like resolve this in a way that is specific to Saudi Arabia in future rounds, other than just having like, because if we both
need evidence that the GCC is going to negotiate between Saudi Arabia and Iran absent the United States. Like that's why it's hard to affirm on this topic. It's a counterfactual that not many people are writing specifically about related to the GCC.
Abe, I think we're good, bro.
Thank you for judging.
All right, thank you everyone for judging and
Hey, best of luck. Yeah, good round. Congratulations.
All right, good luck, Edina.